teraz pozwolicie Państwo, że otworzymy sesję plenarną, wykład plenarny. Jest mi niezwykle miło powitać wszystkich Państwa, a bardzo szczególnie powitać bardzo ciepło i radośnie naszego wspaniałego gościa, profesora Stephena Downesa. With great undisguised pleasure, we have honored to host such a distinguished figure, Professor Stephen Downes, a great authority whose extensive research interests are focused on the music of Central and Eastern Europe, especially Polish music, Chopin, Karłowicz, Szymanowski, and Górecki also. His scholarly efforts have been recognized with numerous awards, and Professor focuses on marginalized areas, shedding new light on their value and significance. He is the author of 8 books, and we are expecting the book devoted to Szymanowski, Karol Szymanowski, New Identities of Karol Szymanowski, and book is expected very soon.
Next year.
Yes. And we are more than happy to have you here, and we are very excited to hear about new identities in Szymanowski's music, especially in Mazurka's Opus 50, number 1. And the title of presentation of Professor Downes is Szymanowski in 1925, Listening for Histories and Identities in the Mazurka, Opus 50, number 1. Welcome cordially.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I feel very humble at being invited to your very special 100-year anniversary conference, and not least a little bit terrified, actually. Here I am, an Englishman, come to talk about Szymanowski, not just in Warsaw, but in this wonderful university, but also in a room named after Szymanowski. So I hope that you know, an Englishman who's loved Polish music for many, many years might be able to give you a new perspective. I mean, what can I tell you about Szymanowski that you don't already know? You've lived with this music all your lives. But I hope that the view from London, if you like, might offer something a little bit different. Excuse me also speaking in English, but my slides will be in English and Polish, and I hope the Polish is okay. Apologies if the Polish translations are a bit bumpy, but I hope they help you as we go along. In May 1921, Szymanowski met Stravinsky for the first time for many years, because during the First World War they hadn't been able to meet. And while Szymanowski was in Paris in 1921, he met Stravinsky for the first time for a long time. And during that meeting, Stravinsky, you probably know the story, played bits of Les Noces to Szymanowski at the piano, because that was the composition that he was working on at the time. And Szymanowski was amazed, but also a little bit bemused that this was music which sounded so different to the music that he knew by Stravinsky. He considered the writer's Spring, Les Secrets de Printemps to be his greatest work. But Les Noces sounded so different. How could this be the music of the same composer? And when he returned to Poland later that year, he wrote an essay on Stravinsky, which wasn't published in his lifetime, but we have it published now, of course. And he began the essay with a question, a rhetorical question, if you like. Who is this? And I think that he was inspired to start this essay with that question, because when he heard Stravinsky's music, Les Noces, the question arose, how can we identify a composer and come to know them through their music when their music seems to change its style, change its voice so radically at a particular given moment? So I think that Szymanowski's essay opens in this way because this was a fundamental question that arose to him after his meeting with Stravinsky. And when we come to historically distant subjects, so for us, these people who lived a long time ago, Of course, these questions become even more challenging. How can we know them? How can we identify them? So the question becomes, who was this? Who was Szymanowski? And of course what we do is try to assemble all the available historical and musical evidence to build a picture of our composer. But the composer's images seem to multiply, so that we have very many Szymanowskis, sometimes overlapping in different ways, but sometimes also appearing to contradict each other, because Szymanowski is a composer who writes in different voices and different styles, and sometimes hides behind masks. So becomes a very sort of challenging figure to identify. Who was Szymanowski? Where is the real Szymanowski? You have this book in Poland? It's very popular in England. Szymanowski is there somewhere. I don't know whether you can find him on the beach. So one of the questions I want to ask in my new book, which I'm writing at the moment, is how we can identify through the music these different characteristics, these different faces, if you like, of Szymanowski. Now, in the early 1920s, at the time when he met Stravinsky, Szymanowski was quite a divisive figure in a Poland when, in a period when the culture, politics and history of Poland were topics, of course, of intense debate. These were years which followed two events of traumatic historical rupture: the end of the cataclysmic First World War and the Russian Revolution, which led to Szymanowski's personal rupture with the loss of the ancestral estate to the Bolsheviks. With the creation of a new, reborn yet precarious nation of Poland in 1919, history would seem to be moving very rapidly, almost instantly, into a new period. On his return to Warsaw at the beginning of 1920, following years of isolation and creative hiatus, Szymanowski became acutely aware that, as a dispossessed aristocrat, as a composer who frequently wrote exotically inspired works, and as an intellectual who yearned to belong to a pan-European culture, that he may now be identified as being on the wrong side of Polish history. New agendas for the new nation threatened to exclude him as an anachronistic, irrelevant, obsolete. He despaired at the provinciality of post-war Warsaw, at how critics in the capital of the new nation were indifferent to his recent artistic achievements because, he believed, they were either ignorant of or didn't understand the newest developments in European music. Geographical and political marginalization had seemingly left Poland on a slow branch of the timeline of musical history. In a 1920 essay on the contemporary musical opinion in Poland, Szymanowski, understandably preoccupied with history, expressed the need for Poland to cast aside inherited failures and burdens of historical inheritance. He framed Polish musical history of the 19th century as beholden to myopic nationalism and as a failure to build on the supreme achievement of Chopin. In these statements, the post-war Szymanowski demanded a clean break from 19th century aesthetics. In his publications, Szymanowski never used the word modernity, but his demand was, in effect, a modernist call for an enthusiastic embrace of the new, for a rupture in musical history. The way that Szymanowski characterized this as exemplifies what recently Frederick Jameson has described as the trope of modernity, an intense displacement of old narrative paradigms and, in modernism, the old aesthetic paradigms. In this sense, modernism pursued an irrepressible search for the break, for the first time, for the new, for a new beginning. And you can see why this was such an urgent question with the establishment of the new Poland. But Jameson continues, the alleged break in history is itself a strategic narratological choice. A way of telling history is constructed to demonstrate the necessity or inevitability of the new moment of rupture. This is the argument Szymanowski constructs in his essay. Conversely, however, an alternative historical narrative could equally be constructed, which emphasizes the priority of sustaining continuity and connection, of progression by evolution. These conflicting constructive strategies serve as a reminder that the epistemological foundations of historiography have always seemed to be under suspicion as ideological. Whether history is constructed and narrated as continuous progress, based on investments in the teleological fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore, because of this, my Latin is better than my Polish, or, contrastingly, as in Thomas Kuhn's influential History of Science, the structure of scientific revolutions, as moments of rupture, of breakthrough, the paradigm shift, or indeed, history as cyclical. The history book on the shelf is constantly repeating itself. I will let you recall that song. Do you know it? Everyone knows Waterloo. Do you remember the line? Okay, you'll have that in your head forever now. I'm sorry about that. And also, some of us remember the 70s more fondly than others. I remember them very well. Now, notoriously, late 20th century postmodernists declared the end of history, since which, however, or perhaps inevitably, we've seen the end of the end, after which, what conceivably follows? A return of modernism? Writing in 2003, Jameson described the early 21st century return of, or reinvention of, modernism after postmodernism. A return of the repressed, but because of the lessons of postmodernity, the return of something necessarily differing from the first phase of modernism. It returns as a second modernism. Similarly, after its apparent postmodern demise, history might return as history, that is, as in a form of as if, or, to put it another way, as meta-history. The return or revenge of a new history manifest in the transformed return of notions of connectivity, directionality, and sincerity. These concepts can be related to the recently much discussed idea of metamodernism. The metamodern marks the reflective recuperation after postmodernism of concepts of historicity, affect, and depth. It is not, however, based on a throwing out of the gains of postmodern thought. It is not either simply a cancellation of postmodernism. Neither is it simply a reactionary reversion to an anachronistic or nostalgic modernism. A second modernism is self-reflectively reclaimed. Furthermore, metamodernism allows toggling or movement between reflective versions of different epistemes, so that postmodern, metamodern, and indeed pre-modern can now coexist. Multiple epistemes, multiple and conflicting ways of constructing historical knowledge might coexist in productive tension. And in parallel, multiple aesthetic investments, multiple and conflicting structures and artistic styles might coexist in a single work or oeuvre. So, what does all of this have to do with thinking about Szymanowski in the 1920s? Metamodernism, after all, emerged as a concept for the critique of new developments in 21st century art. However, just as postmodernism so widely informed critical thinking about culture and history before that of the late 20th century, so the gains of thinking around metamodernism can be highly suggestive of a way to develop new readings of earlier artistic phenomena in terms of comparable historical and cultural logics. It can encourage hearing a toggling, a movement between epistemes as an alternative both to the simplistic periodization of history in which one episteme simply overturns and follows the other. That's the basis of notions of rupture and also the idea of inexorably teleological progress. Jameson proposed that a nuanced historiographical theory of modernity can be developed from a dialectic of continuity and rupture. So, in the light of that idea, I want to ask a fundamental key question, which is why I've put it in my terrible Polish as well as in English. In the manner of the metamodern, therefore, can musical works of earlier times, particularly those composed when rupture and progress were heightened historical and aesthetic issues, for example the works of post-First World War Szymanowski, be heard as working through a dialectic of rupture and continuity by evoking shifting stylistic and aesthetic allegiances? Can musical material that is suggestive of multiple historical identities stand for contesting epistemologies of modernism and a romanticism returning as what I might want to call meta-romanticism? So at the bottom of the screen here, I've very simply put this idea in a visual form. So the one construction of history would be to have the moment of rupture. So we move from romanticism to modernism through a breakthrough into something radically new. The alternative construction of history would be that romanticism simply continues and is somehow metamorphosized or transformed into something we retrospectively understand as modernism. So there's no rupture at all, it just continues. What I want to propose after Jameson's work is that we can actually have both working in a dialectic which never resolves, so that we have a moment of rupture into modernism, a break away from romanticism, but also actually coexistent with that, a sustenance, a sustaining of romanticism after that moment of rupture. But because of that moment of rupture, that breakthrough into newness, we cannot hear those romantic elements in the same way as we could before. It's different. It's not the same romanticism anymore. But it's not simply nostalgic. It's something a little bit more than that. So I want to call it meta-romanticism. This coexistent romanticism alongside the modernism which is achieved through the moment of breakthrough. I hope that framework is clear, because that's going to be the framework for trying to think through Szymanowski's music in the 1920s. So, I mean, the view of Teresa Zielińska, doyenne of Szymanowski scholarship, is that the Mazurkas, Opus 50, announced, alongside the 1921 song cycle Sobiewny, a new compositional path. This rupture narrative, Szymanowski's breakthrough into a new modernism, has early progeny. It was spurred by the composer himself, writing of a turning point with the composition of Sobiewny. And in 1927, in one of the earliest appraisals of Szymanowski's compositional career, the musicologist Jakimecki wrote that this happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly. So this is a moment of rupture, of breakthrough. And the rupture narrative continued to inform Szymanowski scholarship through into the late 20th century. Jim Sampson, my teacher, for example, identified a radical break with the very considerable stylistic gap between the works up to 1918 and Swapievny and the Mazurkas. This narrative of a decisive shift into a new aesthetic has become a critical orthodoxy, held to be a truth of the history of Szymanowski in the 1920s. Swapievny and the Mazurkas play a key role in this modernist story, with the works which followed in the 20s and 1930s viewed as being composed in the spirit of this new aesthetic, building on the gains by clearing away the old aesthetic of the works composed up to 1918. Rupture is succeeded by a period of consequent continuity, the historical logic of post hoc ergo propter hoc. The first Mazurka made its public debut in the Warsaw journal Muzyka, a prestigious musicological publication with which Szymanowski had been closely identified from its very first issue. It was a revelation of the public face of the apparently new Szymanowski. The journal's editor, Mateusz Glinski, said it was a new sensation of crucial significance. New, sensational, a rupture. But for all this talk of rupture, the alternative historical narrative of continuity is also commonly found in appraisals of Szymanowski. These are usually based on identifying him as a composer who, despite stylistic changes across his output, remained a romantic throughout his career. Just like the rupture narrative, this narrative construction of continuity had early progeny and has a long history. So I've just given you a couple of very different examples of the continuity narrative. These will be familiar to you. Zofia Lissa, I know she was writing in a very different ideological time, but her conclusion was that Szymanowski remains a romantic through the stylistic changes. More recently, this idea that Szymanowski, though he lived through a period of modernism, actually sustains a kind of expanded concept of romantic poetics. It's very persuasive story. And just as the rupture narrative has an early origin, so does the continuity narrative. Let's go back to Mateusz Glinski, the editor of Muzyka. He said in the issue of Muzyka, which was dedicated to testimonials on Szymanowski just after Szymanowski had died in 1937, Glinski wrote in 1937, "There is no inconsistency in Szymanowski's musical style. The same radiant tone of romantic rapture is sustained throughout the works. Perhaps for the last time in the history of European art, the noblest echoes of musical romanticism resound in this music." It's also interesting, actually, that Glinski here, with Szymanowski's death, is saying that we have an end of a period of musical history. That marks the end of romanticism in Polish music. But hang on a minute. Professor Glinski seems to be contradicting himself. Do you remember when he published the Mazurka in 1925? He said this was new, sensational, different. But now he's saying that Szymanowski just sustains romanticism through the whole of his output. There appears to be a contradiction. But I want to propose a way forward. I want to propose a way forward by inflecting the historical narrative of modernist rupture with its dialectical opposite, continuity, in the logic proposed by Jameson. How might two epistemologies, the new post-rupture modern and the return of a meta-romanticism, be heard in a kind of negative dialectic that resists the teleological thesis-antithesis synthesis model? Glinski might then be right on both counts. Both rupture and continuity might coexist. Just want to make sure to emphasize that this dialectic never resolves. It always exists in tension. Okay. So what we can do using this framework is reconstruct the historical character of a musical work along these dialectical lines. And it not only gives us a more nuanced view of both rupture and continuity narratives, it can also facilitate rethinking questions of identity, those very questions that Szymanowski had in mind when he met Stravinsky. So Szymanowski was struggling with the same questions that I'm presenting to you now in 1921, when he heard Les Noces and heard a rupture with the Rite of Spring. We now recognise, of course, that Les Noces sustains aspects of the Rite of Spring. That's a different lecture, though. It can also facilitate rethinking questions of identity and how they are evoked within a single totemic musical work, the first Mazurka. That will be my case study. A powerful model of hearing identities within musical materials is offered by Robert Hatton's theory of virtual agency. Hatton describes virtual agents in musical pieces as having the capacity to simulate the actions, emotions, and reactions of a human agent. So they're like avatars. Composers may stage or enact the presence of virtual agents in their work. But, importantly, virtual agency does not depend on authorial intent. We can read the work without it being necessarily what the composer consciously intended. Hatton distinguishes actants, musical materials which have special gestural qualities, agents, virtual, willfully expressed gestures which are like human gestures and human emotions, and actors, which are characters heard playing roles in fictionalized narratives. Actors are virtual agents which you can name, we can give a name to. And then finally, subjectivity, which is Hatton's term for the all-embracing interior reflective identity, in which these different avatars work. It's not quite the same as the historical figure of the composer. It's something that is latent within the work itself. I don't know if Hatton's book is well known in Poland. There is a Polish translation of a Hatton article. It's down the bottom of the screen there, if you wanted to follow it up in Polish. I know Hatton's work is well known, and I know he's been to Poland many times. Hatton's work is closely related to that of Seth Monahan, another American theorist, and Seth Monahan's model of action and agency is very similar. Monahan identifies what he calls a work persona. This is an intra-musical identity living in the present and the past of the piece. So this is very similar. What this is an identity which we hear within the work itself and has its own history within the work, so that when we hear these different identities in the piece, we hear the construction of an identity through a musically embedded historical narrative. So after Monahan, we can posit Szymanowski emerging as an intra-musical identity and also as a subjectivity after Hatton within a work, the first Mazurka, in which different agents, actants and actors are active. The piece will be interpreted as one especially saturated with historical agents and identities, some hidden, some overt, and sometimes conflicting. Hearing these identities will facilitate a rethinking of our historiography of Szymanowski's music in the 1920s. Listening to the Mazurka for these kinds of identities is encouraged by the character of its opening. The opening bars of the Mazurka immediately attained almost iconic significance as the musical signature of the post-war Szymanowski, and it's a status this music widely retains to this day. Its opening melodic descent, derived from Góralski folk music, immediately and famously invokes two actors, to use Hatton's terms, the Góralski musical figures of Sabała and the Zakopane folk violinist Bartosz Abrokta. You've all known this since kindergarten, so I don't need to tell you this again. The motive can also be identified as Chybinski, since it was the musicologist Adolf Chybinski playing choral tunes at the piano which first caught Szymanowski's ear, and it was also Chybinski who influentially defined their identity and revealed their artistic potential to Szymanowski. Chybinski and Szymanowski placed high value in what they heard as a unique archaic barbarism or simplicity in this music. They are, of course, to a large degree, sustaining and elaborating an invention. But they are doing so not only to characterize the sub-hour motive as a synecdoche or symbol for the supposed choral folk authenticity, but also as an agent of historical aesthetic rupture. Paradoxically, of course, by simultaneously invoking an invented ancient tradition. This is a very common paradox in music of this time, not just in Szymanowski, of course, where a composer invokes something very old to make something very new. In an essay published in Muzyka as an accompanying explanatory text to the first Mazurka, Chybinski argued that choral folk melodies differed from the mannerist emphasis on sadness for sadness' sake and the superficial tearful style which he heard in 19th century romantic versions of Polish folk melodies. And in his own essay entitled On Choral Music, 1924, greatly influenced by Chybinski, Szymanowski similarly complained about the needlessly minorized, somewhat sentimental versions of folk songs in the 19th century transcriptions by Polish folk song collectors. Szymanowski's view, like Chybinski's, was that a properly understood choral music offered an urgent counter to the exaggerated sentimentality and neglect of form with which he charged the music of 19th century romantic epigons. Transplanted in modified form into art music, choral musical material offered a way to break away from romanticism into a modern musical episteme. To use Hatton's terms, the Sabała Obrochta Chybinska avatar can be heard as a dramatic actor because it's nameable. We know the figure behind the musical gesture. But it becomes a protagonist in a kind of conflict with the context in which it is heard. This music is so familiar, sometimes we can forget its oddness, its strangeness. It's a peculiar aspect of the first Mazurka that despite the C sharps and the G sharps in the Sabała Obrochta Chybinski melodic actant, the predominant harmonic context is a modally inflected E minor, with a heavy emphasis in the accompaniment on the subdominant minor triad, the A minor triad. The resulting Aeolian mode in E, through the pitches G natural, A natural and C natural, produces false relations with the major third, sixth and raised fourth of the Potalian mode. Many analysts of this piece have noted this dissonance, what we might call polymodal tension. The mood created is one of bittersweet melancholy. It is, strikingly, the only mazurka with this expressive character in the 20 published in Opus 50, where the otherwise avoidance of minor modes and slow tempi may be a strategy to create distance from the sentimental romantic image of Chopin. In that sense, the moment of aesthetic rupture is tinged with an expressive tone verging on the mournful. I will remind you of how it goes. And so on. There we go. Polish music with an English accent. it's seldom mentioned that the first mazurka's melody opens with an anacrusis, with an upbeat, which is tied over onto the downbeat of the first bar to delay the arrival of the subauer obrokta Chybinski actor. Despite its brevity, this is another gesture which marks the opening as odd, since chorale melodies usually begin resolutely on the downbeat. This upbeat therefore carries its own notable agency. As an actant in Hatton's terms, as musical material with special gestural qualities, it does two things. First, it combines with the yearning melancholy through a rising minor seventh, which is an aspirant yet desires a sinking resolution. So that rising seventh at the beginning gives us a kind of yearning expressivity. Secondly, and very subtly, it initiates a process of rhythmic revivification, the holding of the low E over the bar line to rhythmically displace the first note of the subauer, the D, the top D, onto the half beat, generates an emphasis on the durationally longer C sharp as the resolution of D onto C sharp. The agogic accent thereby created on the second beat is one of an attenuated or attenuated mazurka character, since mazurkas, as you all know, often have accented second beats of 3. And subsequently this accented second beat becomes, of course, very strong later in the piece. So at the very beginning, we get the birth of the mazurka's second beat accent, but only because of the upbeat at the beginning. There, that C sharp. And then the second beat is always slightly stronger as we move through the piece. So the upbeat at the beginning performs a very important rhythmic function. But the birth of this new mazurka is coexistent with echoes of the phantoms of the old melancholy romantic style. Through couching the theme with this leaping, rising incipit and supporting it with subdominant minor harmony, the A minor chord, the opening gestural combination enhances the possible function of this material as an avatar for the historical figure of the pre-war Szymanowski through its resulting similarities with the 1904 variations on a Polish folk theme. Let me make sure that you remember this. This is the theme, of course, from Opus 10. And so on. And just to remind you of the rising, so the rising upbeat helps with the recollection, and also the, as we'll see, next slide. This is, of course, to remind you that that theme of the Opus 10 variations comes from Kleczynski's collection of 1888. And it's as shown here in Kleczynski's collection. Now if I transpose that to E minor and then play the Opus 50 mazurka, I hope you can hear the echoes of this pre-war Szymanowski in this melancholy Opus 50 opening. So what we have here is not just an evocation of the radically new, but within it, embedded within it, recollections of something old. The modernist project produces the old as remorselessly as it produces the new. It's the ghost, if you like, in the modernist machine. Kleczynski's collection was condemned by the modernists. By the ruptural Szymanowski, he publicly condemned this collection as belonging to the romantic past. But we know from Chybinski's recollections that Szymanowski copied some of Kleczynski's tunes into his compositional notebooks of the 1920s. These are now lost. And the echoes of Opus 10, which I hear in the opening of the mazurka, are what we might call the pre-war identity Szymanowski-Kleczynski, are heard alongside the new-old Tatra actant. The complex subjectivity or work persona in the mazurka therefore simultaneously evokes and undermines the rupture between pre
and post-war Szymanowskis. But the romantic identities here cannot merely be agents of nostalgic continuity, because they are heard in a context of rupture, within a dialectic which doesn't resolve. The melancholic, even mournful quality of the Opus 50 number 1, therefore, is recontextualized. This is a meta-romanticism. This is heard in the context of the moment of rupture, and the dialectical context disallows the simpler notion of continuity suggested by terms such as neo-romantic or post-romantic. The coexistic continuity similarly disallows the comparison with the irony and distancing and the anti-romantic rupture which usually defines the aesthetic of neoclassicism. Szymanowski's neoclassicist is a huge topic. From my view, I don't think Szymanowski's hardly ever actually a neoclassicist, because there's hardly any irony in Szymanowski, for me anyway. The most obviously new thing about the Mazurkas when compared with the style of the works up to 1918 is its textural and harmonic simplicity. Gone are the extravagant, saturated, richly ornamented textures and chromatic complexities of the piano works such as the Metop. This new simplicity is most apparent when the Sabauer actor melody moves into a monotone melody over a rising modal cadence. So this is music of utter simplicity when here we get a monotone in the right hand and a very simple parallel triads in the left hand. It's the simplest music in the whole of the Opus 50 set. There's nothing as simple as that in any of the other mazurkas of this collection. Now, if I had time, and I don't because I can see what the time is, I would identify that simplicity with another actor, which would be St. Francis. The normal comparison between the Mazurka and St. Francis' Song of Spopievny is the opening, which is, again, another descent in a similar fashion. But I would say that another comparison is the final cadence of that song with the cadence of the first phrase of the Mazurka. If you just play the left hand of the Mazurka opening phrase, and then the I think it's the same cadence or a very similar cadence. Again, this is the only Mazurka with a cadence like that. Go back and check. I think I'm right. So here is a hidden, latent agent. To learn more of what I make of that, you'll have to read my book. Okay, I don't have time to go into that. But the key thing here is that we get another agent of modernism, because this is identified with a pastoral simplicity, a radical simplicity, a clearing away of all the ornaments of the earlier style. But to finish off, there's one further thing which is interesting, which happens in the opening section of this Mazurka, is that we actually get a gradual return of ornament. After that radical, sorry it's a bit grey, I hope you can still see that slide. After the radical simplicity, the new simplicity as I've identified there, the St. Francis gesture, which follows the Sabauer Obrokta. Underneath that, can you see the box Kleczynski? That's because it's minor and they've got the subdominant chord underneath it. So these are the actors at play in this Mazurka. But as the Mazurka repeats the opening phrase, you will know, every time it's repeated, it becomes more and more elaborately ornamented. In one sense, in the accepted sense, this is Szymanowski attempting to recreate Obrokta's performance, because when he heard him perform in Zakopane, he was overwhelmed by the intoxicating performance style, the improvisations that he heard Obrokta play on his violin. And I think what the opening of the Mazurka is an attempt to do is to recreate that in a melancholic reminiscence. But what happens as the ornaments become more and more extravagant, down the bottom of the page here, is that they get more and more like the ornaments of the earlier music. So what we have here is the potential rebirth of an ornamental style out of new simplicity. And if you look at the Opus 62 Mazurkas, which are really interesting later mazurkas, this idea of the return of the ornament becomes even more apparent. And because we're hearing ornaments coming back after the rupture of simplicity, we have to hear them as meta-ornaments. They're not heard in quite the same way as we would hear them in the métopes. So, to summarize, to finish off, encouraged by the often noted dissonance between a motive identified with a specific character, sabauer or obrochta, and its surrounding musical materials, or that minor melancholy, I've deployed notions of actant and agent to hear a work persona in the 1925 Szymanowski as constructed through interpretations of constituent agents and actants functioning as markers of historical rupture. So Sabauer and St. Francis as modernist gestures of rupture, but alongside that, these are at play with agencies which evoke return, the unfinished but broken project of Romanticism, as figured by pre-war melancholic yearning, and decorative ornaments heard under the sign of rupture, as obrochta, improvising. So as the meta-romantic or the meta-ornamental, rather than simply a continuity of the same old thing. So I'm trying again to go back to my original point, trying to nuance the fact that yes, Romanticism is sustained in Szymanowski, but because we have this ruptural moment in the early 20s, we can't hear it in quite the same way anymore. But through this dialectic, the modernist and the meta-romantic exist in this tension. Neither cancels each other out. They play as an unresolved pair within the work persona of Szymanowski. Now, you may have wondered, where is Chopin? Here we are at Chopin's University. Well, again, I'm sorry, I simply don't have time to talk about this. Again, you'll have to read my book, okay, when it comes out next year. Because, of course, Chopin is another actor in this mazurka, inevitably. And he does return in that mazurka in a particularly interesting way. But you have to hear it as meta-Chopin, believe me, because it's not the same as the Chopin we hear in the pre-war Szymanowski music. Okay, and finally also just to this mazurka, although it's a strange mazurka when you compare it to the others in the Opus 50 set, it's not a one-off. It's not just simply a peculiarity, because actually if you listen to the first movement of the second string quartet, or if you listen to the beginning and the end of Hanashi, or if you listen to big chunks of the Fourth Symphony, for example, I think it's really fruitful to listen for the coexistence of a modernism, which is a ruptural breakthrough, and meta-romantic returns of the old gestures. But they don't synthesize, they rub against each other in tension. And I think that tension is one of the markers of Szymanowski's music in the 20s and 30s. So I'm going to leave it there. I slightly overrun my time. I do apologize for that. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Downes, our great guest and great speaker of our conference. So we are fascinating with your very attractive and intriguing concept of Szymanowski's music, new identities. And for me personally, very interesting in this contrast between rupture and continuity and this tension when we speak that they exist together in history. And this rupture is also a very, very interesting moment in composers' careers. We can observe it in many, many examples, because this is the moment to the future, a new beginning, and maybe it reflects the human's need for a new beginning and for something new and something refreshing, giving new energy, a new story to tell, maybe. So this fascinating opposition between two can create the new perspective of a vision of artist, of composer. Thank you very much. So I hope that we have some time for a few questions. So we encourage the audience, please.
Thank you very much for this lecture. One question: this tension between continuity and the rupture, could it be possibly interpreted as irony, despite of what you have said, that there is no irony in Szymanowski? Because if you don't have the closed form, if you have the fragmented aesthetics,
Yes.
it is a marker of irony. What do you think about it?
That's an interesting question. I think the reason why I don't hear, ultimately don't hear Szymanowski's music as ironic is because I don't hear sufficient distance. So, I mean, the comparison with, let's say, Stravinsky's return to older musical styles, we have that huge distance between the original and the returning old thing. And that distance creates this ironic neoclassical aesthetic. What's happening in Szymanowski is that the old thing, the Romanticism, is not really that old, all right? This is the thing. So because it does continue. And I think that that's the key thing, is that we don't, although we get the apparent rupture or break with Swapiewny and the Mazurkas and the other works of the 20s, there's still the coexisting continuity. So that, I think, is why I think we can hear something in Szymanowski which is different to Stravinsky, who was the composer, of course, I started with, the comparison there. And I think that is why it's been so persuasive for many commentators to say that Szymanowski just remained a romantic through his career. And the short answer to that is yes, he did. But the more complex answer is that Romanticism shifts in character, because after 1920 we can't hear it in the same way as we can before then. We have to hear it in a different way. Of course, Szymanowski never had this terminology to hand. Meta-Romanticism was not an idea at all, of course, in the 1920s. And it's interesting, in various moments, I think we can see Szymanowski struggling with how to define Romanticism in a couple of his essays, right? And there's this tension between what we can hear in the music and what he sometimes says in his essays in the 1920s about Romanticism. Partly, I think this is a problem because he doesn't have the critical language, if you like, which, thanks to people like Jameson, we have now the benefit of hindsight, right? Of being able to understand this music of the 1920s and its relationship with the Romanticism, and its complex relationship with Romanticism. And so all the things that Szymanowski struggles with I mean, him and Stravinsky had numerous debates about, some of this is published, over what Romanticism was and how to define it. And I think the basic nub of the problem was that because in the 20s it had changed and it wasn't quite the same thing. And of course this is why Szymanowski is different to Rachmaninoff, for example, for whom there isn't really the same moment of rupture. And of course it's tied very profoundly to the Polish experience of the early 1920s, of the 1980s, and also to Szymanowski's personal experience, of course, of Timoshowska being overrun by the Bolsheviks, and all that old lifestyle, privileged lifestyle, was lost to him. So personal and political trauma play their strong part in this story. But just to finish off, because I know we all need to move on, I've always thought the opening of the first Mazurka was a bit odd. And maybe that's a benefit of being sort of standing outside the tradition and being a slightly different piece to the rest of the Mazurkas. And I thought that maybe it just stands alone as a strange thing. But then I started listening to the other music of the 20s and 30s, as I suggested. And actually I think that it's symbolic of things that are going on elsewhere. Even the work which is often called Szymanowski's most neoclassical piece, the Fourth Symphony, still has moments where the old romantic idiom returns. Think of the slow movement, yes? Moments in the slow movement particularly. But these coexist with the new ruptural style. Think of the finale. So we have this polystylistic tension which coexists, and it goes all the way back to the opening of the first Mazurka.
Thank you very much.
I could talk about Szymanowski for hours, and I'm sure you could too, but we need to move on. Yes. Yes.
Michał Piekarski, Polish Academy of Sciences. Yes, it was a very interesting lecture, but I would like to add about very important meeting in Lwów in 1920, just before the Szymanowski's concert in the Polish Society of Music in Lwów. Lwów was the second important music center in Poland. And after that, after the concert, it was a in private villa of Mieczysław Sołtys, of the director of Polish Music Society, meeting. And there were Mieczysław Sołtys, composer, his son Adam Sołtys, also composer, Professor Chybiński, and Karol Szymanowski. And there was the first time when I think Szymanowski heard the Sabała motif. It was in Lwów, not in mountains. And Professor Chybiński wrote about it in, I think, in 1938 in Muzyka Polska, about the motif from Lwów. It was from mountains, for Polish mountains, but Lwów was very important and the influence of Polish music society and environment for Szymanowski.
Yes.
And also it was a very important city. This way I would like to add.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for that broader context. Yes, no, that's important to recognise that Warsaw isn't Poland, right? Or not all of Poland by any means. And the Lvov context is really important. So thank you for that comment. That's very helpful.
Thank you very much for an extremely interesting paper, which I understood as a proposition of completely new model of history. Am I right? Could you comment something more about it? I mean, the concept of history is having this individual subjective agent of making, and approaching to style, musical styles.
Yes, yes.
Am I right?
Well, I'm not sure that I can claim complete novelty. There's nothing is completely new. I'm not sure that. I mean, I've mainly gained my ideas from the work of Frederick Jameson, who's written really very. I don't know if you know Jameson's work in Poland, whether it's been translated into Polish, any of his work, but this logic that he develops is really interesting. This way of thinking about history, and actually. So what I tried to do, and I think this is the new thing, is combine that way of thinking about history with a way of listening to the music. So I read Hatton's book, and I don't know if you know his work, and I was greatly intrigued by this idea of hearing identities in a piece of music. And I started thinking, well, can we hear through those identities a history, a constructed history within the music itself? And if we construct a model of history which involves this dialectic, of continuity and rupture, of oldness and newness, can we hear that through the actors and agents in the music itself? And for me, I find this very exciting way of combining what Hatton does with musical identities and what Jameson does with musical history. And so when we have these sort of iconic pieces, the first Muzyka is one of those icons of Polish musical history, right? It really is. And I think sometimes for that reason, sometimes we can just sort of take it as it is and think we know it. But if we listen to it very carefully, I think it has this history embedded in it. And just to reiterate, I'm not saying that necessarily Szymanowski composed it in this way, all right? This is not a way to uncover what Szymanowski was consciously doing, okay? Far from it, okay? What I'm doing is try to listen under the surface of the music.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah.